Economic suicide race, China versus India. Growth illusion versus demographic reality. The era of the Chinese miracle is hitting a wall of aging and debt, while India's demographic dividend is a ticking clock that could either build a superpower or ignite a social explosion. Asia's two giants are locked in an economic suicide race where China is fighting to grow before it turns gray, and India is racing to employ its youth before they turn restless. We expose the hidden triggers that will decide who dominates 2026. As we move through 2025 and into 2026, the global economic narrative is being reshaped by a brutal contest between China and India, the economic suicide race. This is a clash between a fading dragon trying to maintain its growth illusion and a rising elephant struggling with its demographic reality. While the headlines focus on GDP percentages, the hidden truth lies in the structural decay of one and the chaotic potential of the other. China's graying debt trap. The economic suicide race finds its most chilling expression in the People's Republic of China, where the state is currently trapped in a terminal convergence of demographic collapse and financial insolvency. For 4 decades, the world marveled at the Chinese miracle, a growth engine fueled by an inexhaustible supply of young, cheap labor and massive credit-driven investment. However, as we move through 2025 and into 2026, the hidden truth is that this engine has not only stalled, it is backfiring. China has entered a graying debt trap, a state where its working-age population is shrinking by millions every year, while its total debt-to-GDP ratio has surged toward an unsustainable 300%. Beijing is now caught in a desperate attempt to fake prosperity through non-productive infrastructure spending, even as the biological foundation of its economy, its people, undergoes a historic collapse. The financial logic of this trap is a matter of brutal mathematics. In a healthy economy, debt is an investment in future productivity. In China, debt has become a tool of social maintenance to hide a deep structural recession. As of late 2025, China's total debt, including corporate, household, and government sectors, is estimated to exceed $50 trillion. A significant portion of this is hidden debt held by local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, used to build highways to nowhere, empty high-speed rail lines, and ghost cities that generate zero economic return. This is the debt deflation trap. The more China borrows to prop up its GDP, the less productive that debt becomes, requiring even more borrowing just to service existing interest payments. The shrinking labor force, the end of the factory of the world. The most irreversible component of China's suicide race is the collapse of its demographic dividend. China is graying faster than any society in modern history, transitioning from a young nation to an elderly one before it has achieved high-income status. The workforce slump. China's working-age population 15 to 64 peaked in 2014 and has been in a steady, accelerating slump ever since. In 2025 alone, the workforce is projected to contract by another several million people. This is not just a statistical decline, it is the death of the factory of the world model. As workers become scarce, labor costs rise, forcing manufacturing to flee to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. The dependency ratio inversion. By 2026, the number of retirees in China is expected to surge toward 300 million, a demographic block larger than the entire population of the United States. With a fertility rate that has crashed to 1.0, well below the 2.1 needed for stability, China has effectively run out of the new labor required to support its massive elderly population. The state is now forced to divert capital away from high-tech R&D to fund a collapsing pension and healthcare system. Faking prosperity. The non-productive investment trap. To mask the reality of a shrinking economy, Beijing has doubled down on a supply-side growth model that relies on massive, state-directed investment in infrastructure. This creates a growth illusion that is no longer rooted in reality. Diminishing returns on capital. In the early 2000s, $1 of debt in China produced nearly $1 of GDP growth. Today, that same dollar of debt produces less than $0.20 of growth. The vast majority of new credit is burned to keep insolvent state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and local governments from defaulting. The infrastructure glut. Despite already having the world's most extensive high-speed rail and highway networks, Beijing continues to pour trillions into new projects in remote provinces with zero population growth. These are non-productive assets. They do not create wealth. They create maintenance liabilities and debt interest. By 2026, The cost of simply maintaining this excess infrastructure will consume a significant portion of local government budgets, leaving nothing for education or social welfare. The Great Solvency Reckoning. The Suicide Race, Part I for China, is a race against a systemic financial collapse. The 15th Five-Year Plan, 2026 to 2030, is beginning under the shadow of a sovereign solvency crisis at the local level. The LGFV time bomb. Local governments are essentially bankrupt. With the property market their primary source of revenue in a permanent downturn, they can no longer service the trillions in hidden debt they accumulated during the boom years. The central government is being forced to execute debt swaps, monetization, effectively printing money to bail out local provinces. This is the same zombie debt trap seen in Japan Part 2, but with a much lower starting point of national wealth. The consumer confidence crisis. The hidden truth of 2026 is that the Chinese consumer has checked out. Seeing their primary asset, real estate, lose value, and their job security vanish, households have shifted into survival mode, hoarding cash and refusing to spend. This fuels the deflationary spiral that makes the massive debt burden even heavier in real terms. In conclusion, China's graying debt trap is a terminal condition where a shrinking population meets a mountain of unproductive debt. Beijing's attempt to fake prosperity through state-led investment is only accelerating the eventual reckoning. For the global investor, China is no longer a growth story, it is a managed decline story. The dragon is growing old and indebted at the same time, ensuring that its role as a global growth engine is permanently over. The race is now to see if China can automate its economy fast enough to replace its disappearing workers, or if the debt bubble will burst first, triggering a lost decade that will dwarf Japan's. India's demographic time bomb. The second front of the economic suicide race is centered on the world's most populous nation, India. While China is fighting a graying debt trap, Part 1 characterized by a shrinking population, India is facing the opposite but equally dangerous phenomenon, a demographic time bomb. With over 50% of its 1.4 billion people under the age of 25, India possesses a youth bulge that is often marketed as its greatest economic asset, the demographic dividend. However, as we move through 2025 and 2026, the hidden truth is that this dividend is rapidly turning into a liability. The sheer scale of India's youth population has created a relentless demand for employment that the current economic structure is failing to meet. To maintain social stability, India must successfully employ at least 10 to 12 million new workers every single year, yet its reliance on a high-skill services sector and a fragmented manufacturing base has created a massive job shortage that is fueling social fragmentation and regional instability. The financial logic of India's time bomb is a race between job creation and social unrest. In 2025, despite a headline GDP growth rate of nearly 7%, India's youth unemployment rate remains stubbornly high, particularly in urban areas and among university graduates. This creates a skills mismatch crisis. India produces millions of engineers and graduates every year, yet nearly 50% of them are deemed unemployable by the private sector, due to an outdated curriculum and a lack of practical vocational training. This surplus of educated but unemployed youth is a volatile political force, susceptible to radicalization and societal polarization. The manufacturing mirage and the infrastructure bottleneck? For India to defuse its demographic bomb, it must replicate the industrialization path of East Asia, transitioning millions of low-skill workers from agriculture into high-volume manufacturing. However, this path is blocked by a permanent infrastructure bottleneck. The logistics tax. In 2025, the cost of logistics in India remains approximately 13–14% of GDP, compared to 8% in most developed economies. Fragmented supply chains, inefficient ports, and a railway network that prioritizes passengers over freight act as a permanent tax on Indian manufacturing. While the Gati Shakti and national logistics policy aim to fix this, the scale of the deficit is so vast that India remains a high-cost environment for the very factories it needs to employ its youth. The power paradox. To be the next global factory, India needs cheap, reliable, 24/7 power. Yet, in late 2025, the grid remains heavily dependent on aging coal plants. Part 4. While struggling to integrate a massive influx of intermittent renewables, this energy instability forces manufacturers to invest in expensive backup systems, further eroding India's competitive edge against Vietnam and Mexico in the race to replace China risk capital. The urbanization trap and regional disparities. India's demographic bomb is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated in the northern heartland states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, which are young, poor, and agriculturally dependent. The failed migration. Unlike the Chinese model, where hundreds of millions migrated to productive coastal cities, India's urbanization is chaotic and underfunded. Migrant workers often find themselves trapped in the informal economy of Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, working low-productivity jobs in construction or retail, with no social safety net. This urbanization of poverty ensures that the youth do not accumulate the wealth necessary to drive the national consumption engine. The interstate divide. While southern states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka are successfully transitioning into high-tech hubs and GCCs, global capability centers, the north remains a demographic powder keg. This creates a two-speed India, where the productive south is increasingly reluctant to subsidize the insolvent, overpopulated north, leading to internal political friction that threatens the long-term stability of the Union. The services ceiling. Why IT cannot save India. A common growth illusion is that India's world-class IT and services sector can bypass the need for an industrial revolution. In 2026, the data confirms that this is a fallacy. The job intensification gap. The IT and BPO sectors, while highly productive and responsible for over $250 billion in exports, only employ about 5 million people directly. They cannot absorb the 10 million new workers entering the market every year, most of whom lack the English skills or technical background required for high-end services. The AI displacement risk. The hidden truth of 2026 is that generative AI is beginning to hollow out the entry-level coding and customer service roles that previously served as India's primary middle-class escalator. As AI automates these rules-based service jobs, the barrier to entry for the Indian youth becomes even higher, turning the demographic dividend into a demographic disaster. The finality of the race. Growing rich versus growing restless. The Suicide Race Part 2 for India is a race against its own clock. India's demographic window, the period where its working-age population is at its peak, is projected to begin closing by 2041. The productivity peril. If India cannot fix its infrastructure and employ its youth in high-productivity manufacturing within the next decade, it will grow old before it grows rich. Like China, it will eventually face an aging crisis, but without the trillion-dollar reserves or the industrial base that China built during its golden age. Social instability as the default. When 10 million young people enter a market with no jobs every year, the result is not growth, it is social incineration. We are already seeing the early signs: mass protests over government recruitment, rising crime in stagnant urban centers, and a brain drain where the top 1% of talent flees to the West, leaving the nation with a surplus of frustrated, underskilled youth. In conclusion, India's demographic time bomb is the definitive challenge to the India rising narrative. While the nation's youth bulge offers a historic opportunity, the failure to address the job shortage and the infrastructure bottleneck has placed India in a state of terminal social risk. For the investor, the hidden truth is that India is a high beta bet. Its growth is real, but its fragility is extreme. To protect your wealth, you must recognize that the demographic dividend is not a guarantee, it is a race that India is currently struggling to win. The manufacturing migration. The third stage of the economic suicide race in Asia is the Great Manufacturing Migration, a structural shift where global capital is fleeing the China risk in search of a new factory of the world. For decades, the global supply chain was anchored in the Pearl River Delta. But in 2025 and 2026, the combination of rising Chinese labor costs, demographic aging, Part I, and intensifying geopolitical decoupling has triggered an irreversible exodus. However, the hidden truth of this migration is that it is not a guaranteed victory for India. Instead, a brutal three-way fight has emerged between India, Vietnam, and Mexico for the factory throne. While India possesses the largest labor pool, it is currently being outmaneuvered by its rivals due to a persistent culture of regulatory hurdles and red tape that threatens to turn its industrial rise into a stagnant middle-income trap. The financial logic of this migration is driven by the China Plus One strategy. Global corporations from Apple and Samsung to Tesla and BASF are no longer willing to bet their entire production capacity on a single, increasingly hostile jurisdiction. They are diversifying. But capital is a coward. It flows, not to where the population is largest, but to where the friction of doing business is lowest. In 2026, India is finding that its ambition to be a global manufacturing juggernaut is being strangled by its own bureaucracy, even as Vietnam and Mexico provide slicker, more integrated alternatives for the capital fleeing Beijing. The competition for the crown, Vietnam and Mexico's edge. While India markets its demographic dividend Part 2, Vietnam and Mexico are winning the efficiency dividend. Vietnam. The logic of proximity. Vietnam has quietly but decisively claimed the mantle of the primary beneficiary of the China Plus One wave. In 2025, its GDP growth, fueled by manufacturing, has outpaced most of ASEAN. Vietnam's hidden truth is its integration. It sits at the doorstep of Chinese supply chains, while maintaining free trade agreements, FTAs, with both the West and the RCEP bloc. For a smartphone or electronics firm, moving to Vietnam is low friction because the components still come from China, but the assembly is safe. Mexico. The logic of nearshoring. For the North American market, Mexico is the undisputed king. By 2026, Mexico has solidified its position as the top trading partner of the U.S., leveraging the USMCA to provide duty-free, rapid response manufacturing. While India struggles with a 30-day shipping time to the U.S., Mexico can deliver goods via truck in 48 hours. This speed to market is a competitive wall that India's manufacturing sector, despite its low labor costs, is finding impossible to climb. India's industrial asphyxiation, the red tape jungle. The suicide race, Part 3, for India, is a race against its own internal gatekeepers. Despite high-profile programs like Make in India and Production-Linked Incentives, PLI, the actual experience of building a factory in India remains a bureaucratic nightmare. The land and labor maze. In 2026, land acquisition remains the ultimate deal killer for foreign direct investment, FDI. Acquiring industrial land in India can take 10 to 20 times longer than in Vietnam or Singapore due to messy titles and local litigation. Compounding this are India's zombie labor laws, a collection of over 40 national and hundreds of state-level regulations that make it nearly impossible to scale a workforce. Many firms intentionally stay small below the 100-worker threshold to avoid the regulatory red tape that triggers intrusive inspections and union mandates. The Tariff King Paradox. India possesses some of the highest import tariffs in the world. While intended to protect domestic industry, this protectionist trap backfires by making the raw materials and components needed for high-tech manufacturing, like semiconductors and specialized chemicals, prohibitively expensive. India wants to be a global exporter, but its import substitution mindset makes its final products uncompetitive compared to the duty-free hubs of Southeast Asia. The hollowing out of the SME sector. The manufacturing migration is currently creating a two-tier industry in India. While giants like Foxconn can negotiate fast-track deals with the Prime Minister's office, the 63 million small and medium enterprises, SMEs, that form the backbone of any industrial economy are being left behind. Compliance over innovation. The average Indian SME manufacturer spends more time and capital on compliance management, filling out forms, dealing with tax inspectors, and navigating GST goods and services tax complexity than on improving its machinery or technology. This ensures that India's supply chain remains shallow, with the nation acting more as a final assembler of foreign parts rather than a value-added producer. The finance gap. India's banking system remains wary of lending to small manufacturers. The credit gap for SMEs in 2025 is estimated at over $300 billion, forcing these firms to rely on informal, high-interest loans that incinerate their margins. Without a vibrant SME ecosystem, India cannot build the industrial clusters necessary to compete with the integrated supply chains of China or Vietnam. The finality of the migration, a window closing. The hidden truth for 2026 is that the window for India to become the next China is not open forever. The automation cliff. As China automates its factories to survive its demographic collapse, Part I, the cost advantage of India's low-wage labor is eroding. If India does not fix its red tape and infrastructure within the next 3 to 5 years, it will find that the factories it spent a decade chasing have been replaced by lights-out robotic plants in the US or China. The regulatory exit. We are already seeing regulatory flight, where Indian entrepreneurs themselves are moving their headquarters to Singapore or Dubai to escape the domestic tax terrorism and bureaucratic friction. When a nation's own industrialists are fleeing, the economic suicide race has entered its terminal phase. In conclusion, the manufacturing migration is a once-in-a-generation opportunity that India is currently in danger of squandering. While capital is fleeing the China risk, it is finding a more welcoming home in Vietnam and Mexico. India's red tape is not just a nuisance, it is a structural barrier that is keeping millions of its youth, Part 2, in poverty. For the investor, the hidden truth is that India is a story of potential that is being held hostage by its own gatekeepers. To protect your wealth, you must look past the Make in India headlines and identify the few specific states and sectors that have actually managed to dismantle the red tape or follow the capital to the slicker, more efficient factories of the Southeast Asian rivals. IV. The Great Solvency Reckoning. The climax of the economic suicide race in Asia is the arrival of the Great Solvency Reckoning. This is no longer a battle of GDP growth rates, but a war of balance sheets. In 2025 and 2026, the continent is split between two opposing financial poisons: China's deflationary collapse and India's inflationary credit bottleneck. The hidden truth that both Beijing and New Delhi are desperate to ignore is that their respective models have reached their fiscal limits. China's $430 trillion property-driven credit bubble is finally imploding, dragging the nation into a lost decade of deflation. Meanwhile, India's ambitious growth story is hitting a wall because its banking system and credit markets lack the depth to fund the massive scaling required to employ its youth. Part 2. The winner of this race will not be the one who innovates fastest, but the one who can manage their systemic rot longer without a total social or currency meltdown. The financial logic of this reckoning is a study in balance sheet recession. For China, the problem is a surplus of debt and a deficit of demand. For India, the problem is a surplus of demand and a deficit of reliable, long-term capital. Both giants are staring into a fiscal abyss, and the choices they make in 2026 will determine whether the Asian century continues or if the region follows Japan into a multi-generational stagnation. China's deflationary death spiral. China has officially entered the most dangerous phase of its graying debt trap. Part I. Debt deflation. As the property bubble, which once accounted for 25% to 30% of GDP, continues its slow-motion implosion, the wealth of the Chinese middle class is being systematically incinerated. The negative wealth effect. Because 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in real estate, the falling prices have triggered a total collapse in consumer confidence. In 2025, Chinese households are in saving overdrive, refusing to spend because they feel poorer every day. This leads to falling prices, which leads to lower corporate profits, which leads to wage cuts, creating a vicious cycle of deflation. The ineffective stimulus. Beijing's attempt to print its way out of this crisis is failing because the transmission mechanism is broken. Banks are unwilling to lend to a bankrupt property sector, and consumers are unwilling to borrow. The hidden truth is that China is pushing on a string. No amount of liquidity can fix a population that has lost faith in the future value of its primary asset. India's credit gap and the scaling paradox. While China drowns in debt, India is starving for the right kind of credit. India's demographic time bomb, Part 2, requires a massive scaling of manufacturing and infrastructure, but the nation's financial plumbing is not built for this magnitude. The missing middle of credit. India's banking sector is top-heavy, dominated by state-owned banks that prefer lending to safe, large conglomerates, the chaebalization risk, rather than the millions of SMEs needed for job creation. In 2026, the credit gap for small industries remains a terminal bottleneck. Without access to affordable long-term capital, Indian entrepreneurs cannot scale fast enough to compete with the automated factories of the West or the efficient clusters of Vietnam. Part 3. Inflationary growth pressures. Unlike China's deflation, India faces persistent structural inflation. As the government borrows heavily to fund infrastructure, it crowds out private investment and keeps interest rates high. This creates a scaling paradox. India needs to grow at 8% to survive its demographics, but the cost of the capital required to reach 8% growth fuels the very inflation that destabilizes the currency and the poor. The systemic rot, corruption versus bureaucracy. The suicide race is ultimately a test of which nation can reform its systemic rot before it becomes fatal. Both nations are failing this test in different ways. China's centralization trap. In 2026, the Communist Party's obsession with control has become the primary barrier to solvency. By prioritizing state-owned enterprises, SOEs, over the dynamic private sector, Beijing is protecting the zombie parts of its economy while strangling the only entities capable of genuine innovation. The rot here is political. The state would rather manage a decline it controls than a recovery it doesn't. India's regulatory asphyxiation. India's rot is the red tape analyzed in Part 3. The hidden truth is that the Indian state remains deeply suspicious of the private sector, maintaining a labyrinth of gatekeepers who extract rent at every level of the economy. This bureaucracy ensures that capital flight, Part IV of the global analysis, remains a constant threat, as Indian wealth seeks simpler, more transparent jurisdictions like Singapore or Dubai. The global realignment. The winner of the reckoning. The winner of the Great Solvency Reckoning will be the nation that manages to export its problems most effectively to the rest of the world. China's deflation export. Beijing is responding to its internal collapse by dumping its overcapacity onto global markets. From electric vehicles to steel, China is exporting deflation to protect its factories. This is triggering a global wave of protectionism, Part 3 of the global analysis, as Europe and the US move to block Chinese goods, further isolating the Chinese economy and accelerating its internal rot. India's safe haven mirage. India is attempting to position itself as the anti-China safe haven for global capital. While it is successfully attracting China risk flight capital, it has not yet proven it can absorb that capital efficiently. In 2026, the hidden truth for investors is that India's markets are high-priced and low-depth. If the global liquidity cycle turns, India's lack of a deep, domestic bond market makes it highly vulnerable to a sudden, painful exodus of foreign capital. In conclusion, the Great Solvency Reckoning is the final stage of the Asian economic suicide race. China is a dragon being crushed by the weight of its own past debt and a disappearing future. India is an elephant trying to run a marathon while being tied down by red tape and a lack of financial fuel. Both nations are staring at a structural wall. For the investor, the hidden truth is that the era of easy Asian growth is over. Survival in 2026 requires moving away from broad emerging market indices and towards specific, resilient niches that are insulated from China's deflationary pull and India's inflationary bottlenecks. The race is no longer about who wins, but about who survives the inevitable realignment of Asian power. This concludes our comprehensive analysis of the global economic suicide race. From the debt-laden West to the demographically dying East, the world of 2026 is a landscape of structural rot and managed decline. Your financial survival depends on identifying the hidden truths before they become mainstream realities. The economic suicide race between China and India is the most significant geopolitical shift of our time. As China's dragon grows old and India's elephant struggles to find its footing, your traditional emerging market strategy is obsolete. The hidden truth is that both giants are more fragile than they appear. Subscribe to Secret Wealth Tactics now, and join our community of elite investors. We analyze the hard data on demographics, debt, and industrial policy that the mainstream media ignores. Activate your notifications to get the specific tactics for moving your capital away from the growth illusion and into the few resilient sectors that will survive this Asian clash. Stay ahead of the collapse, get the truth today.